They say the office is just a place to work. But that night, when my boss asked me to turn off the lights, I realized it could also be the place where two souls finally saw each other clearly. The office always looked different at night. During the day, it was filled with movement. The sound of phones ringing, keyboards clicking, footsteps rushing past my desk. But tonight, all of that had faded. The long hallway outside was empty, and the silence inside felt almost like stepping into another world. I sat at my desk, pretending to focus on the report in front of me, but my attention kept drifting. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting sharp white shadows across the room. Through the half-closed blinds, I could see the city glowing in the distance. Towers lit up like constellations, cars moving like rivers of red and gold far below. And then there was her, my boss. She was still working long after everyone else had gone home. Her desk lamp threw a warm circle of light around her, softening her face in ways I had never noticed before. She wasn't the same commanding presence she was during the day. No clipped tone, no sharp instructions. Instead, she looked thoughtful, almost fragile, though she carried that fragility with a kind of grace I couldn't look away from. Her hair, usually pinned back with precise neatness, now had a few loose strands falling against her cheek. Every so often, she would tuck them behind her ear absent-mindedly, her focus locked on the documents in front of her. That small, human gesture made her feel less like the boss and more like a woman who had stayed too long in a place that demanded too much of her. I should have left by then. My own work was done, but something in me wanted to linger, not out of disobedience, not out of some childish fascination, but because in the stillness of that night, I wanted to see her not as the world saw her, but as she really was. I glanced at the clock. It was past 10. Outside, the streetlights hummed faintly, and the city felt alive yet far away, like we were sealed in a glass dome above it all. The office had become ours, in a way, not by intention, but by accident. Still, the longer the silence stretched, the more it felt like some invisible thread was weaving itself between us. She sighed quietly, rubbing her temples. It wasn't a sound of frustration, but of quiet exhaustion, the kind of person only lets slip when they think no one is listening. That sigh hit me harder than any order she had ever given during the day. For the first time, I realized how heavy her responsibilities must be, how much of herself she poured into keeping everything and everyone together. And I couldn't help it. I admired her, not just for her authority, but for the quiet strength beneath it, for the way she carried herself when no one was watching. I leaned back in my chair, the silence pressing in, and thought, maybe this night wasn't just another late shift. Maybe it was the beginning of something I couldn't yet name. The minutes stretched on, and the silence between us deepened. I could hear the faint scratch of her pen, the occasional soft rustle of paper, even the rhythm of her breathing as she worked. It was strange. In a room so large, with desks and chairs scattered everywhere, it felt as though all the air had been pulled into the small space between her and me. I was just about to gather my things and finally leave when she spoke. "Turn off the lights," she said. Her voice was calm, low, but it carried across the room like it was meant for me alone. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. But when I looked up, she was leaning back slightly in her chair, her hand resting loosely on the armrest, her gaze still fixed on the papers in front of her. She hadn't even glanced in my direction. I froze, caught somewhere between instinct and hesitation. Part of me wanted to move immediately, to obey like I always did. She was my boss, after all. But another part of me lingered, caught off guard by the intimacy of the request. Turning off the lights would leave us in the quiet glow of her desk lamp and the silver wash of the city outside. It would change the room, change the moment. I rose slowly from my chair, the wheels creaking faintly against the floor. My footsteps echoed as I crossed the office, each one measured, deliberate, like I was walking toward something more than just a light switch. When I reached the wall, I hesitated. My hand hovered above the switch, but I couldn't bring myself to flip it. Not yet. I turned, looking back at her. She was still at her desk, but this time her head was tilted slightly, her profile outlined against the dim backdrop of the window. There was no trace of her usual sharpness, no command in her posture. She simply looked tired, a woman who had carried too much weight through the day, now asking, almost quietly, for a little peace. And I realized then what unsettled me. This wasn't a boss giving her employee an order. This was something softer, something unspoken. It was almost like she was asking me to help her close out the day, to leave the world outside, and let the night belong only to us. My fingers brushed the edge of the switch, but instead of pressing it down, I let my words come first. "And let me see you first," I whispered. The words slipped out before I could stop them, honest and unguarded. For a heartbeat, the room felt utterly still. She lifted her gaze at last, her eyes meeting mine across the quiet office. There was no anger there, no reprimand, just the faintest flicker of surprise, quickly followed by something I couldn't quite name. Curiosity, maybe, or recognition. In that instant, I knew I hadn't crossed a line. I had simply revealed what had been there all along, a longing not to let this moment disappear into darkness too soon. I hadn't planned to say those words. They just slipped out, raw and unpolished, yet truer than anything I'd spoken all day. "And let me see you first." The office seemed to hold its breath. Even the faint hum of the air conditioner felt muted, as though the room itself was waiting for her reaction. My hand still hovered near the switch, but I couldn't move. My eyes were locked on her, and for the first time, she was looking back at me, not as a superior, not as the woman who signed my paychecks, but as someone caught off guard by honesty. She blinked slowly, her lips parting slightly, though no words came. The usual armor she wore during work hours, the firm tone, the steady posture, all of it seemed to falter in that one moment of stillness. Instead, I caught something softer, something vulnerable. A faint smile tugged at the corner of her lips, not playful, not dismissive, but almost as though she were acknowledging something unspoken between us. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing just a little, as though she were studying me, not as her employee, but as a man who had dared to reveal what he truly felt. I swallowed, my chest tight, but I didn't look away. The silence between us wasn't heavy. It was alive, filled with an electricity that pressed against the edges of my skin. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers drumming lightly on the armrest, then pausing mid-motion. Her gaze lingered on me, and though her expression remained calm, I could sense the shift in her, a quiet acknowledgement that something had changed. Finally, she spoke, her voice lower than usual, almost a murmur. "You shouldn't say things like that." Her words carried no sharpness, no reprimand. If anything, they trembled with a quiet uncertainty. I let a breath escape, steadying myself. "Maybe not," I admitted softly, "but it's the truth." The words hung in the air, and for a moment I thought she might end it there, that she would remind me of boundaries, of rules, of the invisible line between us. But she didn't. Instead, her eyes softened, and a silence stretched long enough for me to notice the way her hand rested on the edge of the desk, her fingertips brushing against a stack of papers she no longer seemed interested in. I took in every detail, the curve of her shoulders under the faint light, the way a loose strand of hair caught the glow, the quiet strength in her even as she seemed uncertain of herself. And I realized what I wanted wasn't reckless. It wasn't about breaking rules or crossing lines. It was about seeing her, really seeing her, without the mask she wore every day. For just a moment longer, she let me. She didn't look away, didn't put the walls back up. She let me hold her in that gaze, and it felt like the most intimate permission she had ever given me. I knew then, the lights could wait. For a long heartbeat, neither of us moved. Her eyes held mine across the dimly lit office, steady yet softened in a way I had never seen before. Then at last, she gave the faintest nod, so small it might have been missed if I hadn't been searching for it. That was all the permission I needed. My hand pressed down on the switch. The fluorescent lights blinked once before giving way to darkness, and the room shifted instantly. What had been sharp and sterile a moment ago now became something quieter, almost tender. The only light left came from her desk lamp and the vast city beyond the glass windows. Towers shimmered in the distance, their reflections spilling silver-blue patterns across the walls and floor. The office, once so rigid, so defined by order and routine, suddenly felt like an entirely different place. The air itself seemed to breathe differently, softer, warmer, as though the night had claimed it for its own. I turned slowly, letting my eyes adjust. She sat there, illuminated only by that small circle of golden light. The glow wrapped around her like an embrace, softening the angles of her face, tracing the line of her jaw, and catching in her eyes when she finally looked back at me. Without the overhead glare, she no longer looked like the woman who commanded meetings or delivered sharp instructions. She looked human, tired, yes, but beautifully so, like someone who had spent too many nights fighting invisible battles no one ever thanked her for. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. I walked back toward my desk, each step slow, deliberate, as though I didn't want to disturb the quiet spell that had settled over the room. She followed me with her gaze, though she didn't speak. I could sense her watching, not with suspicion, but with an awareness, as if she, too, felt the air between us shift into something neither of us could deny. When I sat down again, the silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It carried weight now. I could hear the faint hum of the city outside, the distant sound of a car horn far below, the whisper of papers as she shifted them absent-mindedly. And then, without warning, she exhaled a long, quiet sigh. Not of annoyance, not of impatience, but of release. As though in this new softness, she could finally let down a part of herself she kept locked away during the day. That sigh lingered in me. It told me more than words ever could. That beneath her strength was a woman who longed, even if silently, for someone to notice the weight she carried. I didn't dare speak just yet. Instead, I let the moment hold, my gaze steady on her. And in that dim, fragile space, it felt as though something invisible had shifted, as though the darkness itself had drawn us closer together. I realized then, this night was no accident. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt necessary, as though the night itself demanded patience, that neither of us rush what was unfolding. She shifted slightly in her chair, the golden lamplight spilling across her features. Her fingers, elegant and steady during the day, now moved slowly, tracing the rim of a glass of water sitting beside her papers. It was a small, almost absent gesture, but to me, it carried more weight than any word she might have spoken. Finally, she broke the silence. "You know," she said softly, her voice carrying less certainty than I'd ever heard from her, "people think strength means never showing cracks. That if you stand tall enough, long enough, no one will notice when you're tired." She paused, her eyes fixed on the glass in her hand. The reflection of the city lights danced against its surface, shimmering faintly. But the truth is, sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you're exhausted. Her tone wasn't directed at me, not at first. It was as though she was speaking to herself, giving voice to thoughts she had carried silently for too long. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the desk, keeping my movements unhurried. I didn't want to break whatever fragile honesty had just surfaced. "I can't imagine how much you carry," I murmured. "I see how everyone looks at you during the day. They rely on you like you're unshakable." She gave a small, rueful smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Unshakable," she repeated quietly, almost to herself. "What they don't see is that sometimes I'm holding it all together with nothing but willpower." Her voice wavered then, just slightly. It was enough to make my chest tighten. For the first time, I wasn't seeing her as my boss, the woman whose approval I sought, whose instructions I followed. I was seeing her as a woman who had spent too many years hiding her own fragility behind poise and authority. I didn't interrupt. I let her words settle, let her own silence carry the weight they deserved. Sometimes, listening was more powerful than anything else. After a long pause, she lifted her gaze. The vulnerability there startled me, not because it made her look weak, but because it made her look real. "You're quiet," she said, her tone softer now, almost questioning. "I don't want to say the wrong thing. I admitted honestly. I don't want to break this moment. Her lips parted as though to respond, but then she only nodded, her expression unreadable yet open. And in that unspoken exchange, something shifted. I realized she didn't need solutions. She didn't need promises. What she needed maybe was what no one else had given her in a long time. Presence. Someone willing to sit with her in the dim light, to let her speak her truths without judgment, without expectation. So I stayed quiet, not out of fear, but out of respect. And in that silence, something between us grew deeper than I had ever imagined it could. The silence stretched again, but it was no longer heavy. It carried something else now, a quiet intimacy, like the air itself had shifted to wrap us in its stillness. She sat across from me, her posture a little more relaxed than before. The strong lines of her authority had softened, replaced by something unguarded. Her hand rested on the desk, not purposefully, just lying there against the polished wood, her fingers curved slightly as though they had forgotten to keep their composure. My eyes lingered on that hand. It was the same hand that had signed contracts, pointed across meeting tables, and gestured with confidence that left no room for doubt. But here, in the soft half-light of the office, it was simply a hand, elegant, steady, and just a little tired. I hesitated. A dozen thoughts raced through me. What it would mean, what it might risk, what she might think. But then I looked back at her face. She wasn't watching me, not directly. Her gaze had drifted toward the window, her expression quiet, reflective. And in that moment, I felt a certainty stronger than my fear. She didn't need words. She needed someone to reach across the silence. Slowly, deliberately, I moved my hand across the desk. My fingertips brushed the edge of hers before settling gently over her hand. The warmth startled me. It wasn't the kind of warmth that fades quickly. It sank into my skin, steady and grounding. Her fingers stiffened at first, the instinct of someone unaccustomed to being touched so simply, so carefully. But she didn't pull away. Instead, after a moment, her hand shifted ever so slightly, her fingers curling against mine, acknowledging the contact. I looked up, afraid of what I might see in her eyes. But she wasn't looking at me. Not yet. Her gaze remained on the city skyline, though I caught the smallest change in her expression, a breath released, a tension easing, as if that single touch had allowed her to let go, just a little. For me, the moment was everything. My hand resting on hers wasn't bold, wasn't reckless. It was steady. It said what I couldn't yet put into words. I see you. I'm here. Finally, she turned her head, her eyes meeting mine. In them, I didn't see surprise or disapproval. I saw something far more fragile, a quiet gratitude, mingled with a vulnerability she had long kept hidden. Her lips parted, as though she might speak, but no words came. Instead, her thumb brushed lightly against my hand, a subtle movement, small but deliberate. And that single gesture said more than any sentence ever could. We didn't rush it. Neither of us moved beyond that simple connection. But in the stillness of that moment, I felt a promise, not of grand declarations or sudden confessions, but of something real, something fragile, and something that, if nurtured carefully, could grow. And for the first time that night, I understood. The distance between us had already disappeared. The quiet lingered, but it wasn't awkward. Her hand beneath mine had changed everything. That simple contact had shifted the air between us, turning the office into something far more personal than it had ever been before. We sat like that for a long moment, neither of us speaking. Her thumb still rested lightly against my hand, not moving but not pulling away either. It was as though we were both afraid to disturb the fragile peace we had found. Eventually, she drew in a slow breath, her gaze returning to the papers on her desk, though I could tell she wasn't really seeing them anymore. She gently slid her hand back, not abruptly, but with a lingering brush of her fingers that told me it wasn't rejection. It was simply her way of reminding us both of the world waiting outside this room. "I should finish this," she murmured, her voice soft, almost reluctant. I nodded, though my chest felt heavy at the thought of letting go of the moment. Of course. But as I stood to leave, something in her shifted. She pushed her chair back quietly and rose to her feet. The soft glow of the desk lamp caught her profile, outlining the quiet strength in her shoulders, the graceful curve of her neck. For the first time, I realized how rare it must be for her to let anyone see her like this, unarmored, unguarded. I walked toward the door, the city lights painting long shadows across the carpet. My hand brushed against the cool metal of the handle, but before I could turn it, I felt her presence close behind me. I turned, and she was there, just a step away. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was thick, not with tension, but with meaning. Then, with a tenderness I hadn't expected, she lifted her hand and let her palm rest lightly against my cheek. The touch was brief, almost tentative, but it sent warmth flooding through me. Her fingers were soft, steady, as though she were silently saying everything she couldn't put into words. My breath caught, and I leaned ever so slightly in her hand, memorizing the feel of it, knowing it was a gesture I might never forget. "Thank you," she whispered. "Not as my boss, not as the woman who led with authority all day, but as someone who, just for tonight, had let herself be seen." I wanted to reply, to say something that matched the weight of her words, but nothing seemed enough. So I simply nodded, letting my silence carry the promise that this moment mattered to me more than anything. She pulled her hand back slowly, her expression soft, unreadable yet warm. And then she stepped back, giving me space, as though to remind us both that tomorrow the world would return to its routines. I left the office that night with the imprint of her touch still on my skin, lingering like a quiet fire. The city air felt cooler, sharper, yet I carried a warmth inside me that nothing could dim. It wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't an ending wrapped in certainty. But it was real, a beginning built not on words, but on trust, patience, and a single, unforgettable touch. If this story touched you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more heartfelt age gap romance stories. Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know which moment stayed with you the most.